Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that eventually, after much consideration, Alexander Hamilton ended up endorsing Thomas Jefferson for the presidency after the electoral tie? And that while the House of Representatives was deadlocked, President John Adams refused to step in and put in a good word for his former friend Thomas Jefferson to help break the tie. And that right before leaving office, John Adams created dozens of new positions in the judiciary and filled their lifetime appointments with a bunch of Federalists. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 91, The Revolution of 1800. All right, everyone, welcome into the Revolution of 1800. We are officially, right, and by the way, the election of 1800 is nicknamed the Revolution of 1800, which is where the name of the episode comes from. We are officially transitioning out of the Adams presidency into the Jefferson presidency. But just a couple real quick things to get to before we do that. Number one, I'm going to actually be changing the logo on the podcast, which I'm pretty excited about. So keep an eye out for that next week. And when I do that, I'll let you know who the person was responsible for that in case you want to reach out to them and give you their contact, etc. I got a tweet from loyal listener Ann last week, and she said, "Hey, Chris, I told you a few months back I would patron up, quote unquote, when I was working again. It's small to start, but I signed up and encourage other ATH listeners to take the plunge. Can't wait to hear more." And thanks for, number one, becoming a patron, number two, sending out that tweet, and number three, encouraging others to do it too. So if you've been sitting around considering doing it like Ann, or have been wanting to do it, please support the show. It'd be a huge help. Lastly, my book recommendation for today is Adams vs. Jefferson, The Tumultuous Election of 1800 by John Ferling. It is a fantastic read. There are a few different books out there on the election of 1800. I'm sure they're all quite good. This one was my favorite, and this is the one I recommend, and it's pretty straightforward. It covers the tumultuous election of 1800, which we're getting into a bit today. Last week, we wrapped up the presidency of John Adams. He was able to secure peace with France, albeit too late to impact his re-election chances. He lost the election of 1800, and he was somewhat looking forward to what he hoped would be a quiet and more restful retirement. That being said, John Adams may have felt a little relief, but make no mistake, he wasn't happy about the result. He wasn't happy that he was no longer president. His pride and his ego was hurt pretty bad. He took it personally. The fact that his own vice president ran against him and unseated him, he was embarrassed that George Washington was given 2 terms and asked by some people to run for a third, whereas he, not only wasn't asked to run for a third term, but his own vice president wasn't even interested in him running for a second term. And this is a reality and dynamic that I think people don't really consider often enough. John and Abigail, yes, they had some relief about Adams no longer having to deal with the burden of office. But beneath all of that, they were really disappointed, personally and professionally, with Thomas Jefferson. His aggressive and outspoken opposition to his own president, and the audacity he had to run against him and not allow him to serve a second term like Washington, was something that the Adams family took very personally. While John allowed much of the criticism from Republican opposition to roll off his back and didn't get too hung up in the nonsense, it was the actions taken not by the Republicans but Jefferson himself, someone considered a close friend, that infuriated Abigail and embittered John. As we will see today, John may have put on a good face publicly about the whole thing, but he didn't really handle it as professionally as he likely would have if he could do it all over again. So, the election of 1800. Adams loses the election, coming in third in total electoral votes behind Jefferson and Aaron Burr, two Republicans who both tied with 73 votes. And one thing I've always found interesting about the narrative of this election, first off, number one, Jefferson and Burr were not supposed to tie. There was a Democratic-Republican plan for someone to not vote for Burr, so Jefferson would beat him by one vote. But that plan wasn't really obviously executed properly, and they both tied. But they weren't supposed to tie. So there were a lot of Democratic-Republican operatives within the party that were none too pleased that there was a tie. But another thing about this election that's usually overlooked is, just how well John Adams did. A lot of times people view his presidency so negatively, and considering all of the things we've covered over the last few weeks, you can sort of understand why. But in the end, the Republicans threw brutal political attacks his way. He was running against the great Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. And he had high-ranking members in his own party speak out against him. He had his own cabinet turn on him. And he had the incredibly influential Alexander Hamilton writing a pamphlet just ripping him to pieces. And he still only lost by 8 votes. He actually did far better than many Federalists had expected him to. And think about it this way. These elections are so close. If only 250 people in the state of New York changed their vote to John Adams, he would have won the presidency by 10 votes, 71 to 61. That's it. Only 250 people, and the electoral vote experiences an 18-vote swing. And remember, this is also without him being able to campaign on the peace that he was able to broker with France. And with these results, Adams was sure that the partisan nature of politics was here to stay. Look, he wasn't all that surprised by Thomas Jefferson's vote totals. He expected to lose to Thomas Jefferson. But 73 votes for Aaron Burr? Come on. Clearly, these votes were based more on party than anything else. At least that's what Adams was convinced of. He actually complained that these results, specifically Burr's 73 votes, were an, quote, encouragement to party intrigue and corruption. In the end, party politics won the day, and Adams' decision to send the Second Peace Commission to France and to directly oppose Hamilton is what did him in. But what happened next? Jefferson and Burr were tied. This was the first and still the only time there has ever been a tie in the electoral results in a presidential election. With each passing day, tension grew in the country as they did not know who their next president would be. But let's take a step back and examine how the heck all of this happened in the first place. The first problem was the way the Electoral College voted on candidates in 1800. There was no way to distinguish which man you wanted for president and which one you wanted for vice president. So in theory, right, just to throw numbers out there, 70 of the 73 votes Burr received may have been cast with the expectation that he would be vice president, not president. Heck, all 73 ballots could have had this intention. But because there was no way to specify your intent, they were all treated the same. And it was designed this way because the founders did not expect political parties to develop so quickly. They figured there'd always be a small handful of men running, like 4, 5, 6, and this method would be a simple way to decide the best two. Another problem? If there was a tie, like there was in this election, the winner would then be determined by the House of Representatives. Makes sense, I guess, right? The problem with this, though, the House of Representatives that is voting on the new president isn't the new House of Representatives, but instead is the lame duck members of the House. Some of the men voting aren't even going to be in government when the winner of the vote takes office. they were voted out. Why the heck should they get a vote? They just lost their re-election campaign. The people had spoken, and they don't want them to have influence. And lastly, the votes in the House weren't by individual, but in fact they were by state, which made the results skewed, considering the largest and smallest states would not be accurately apportioned. With this tie representing a clear and undeniable political mess, many Democratic Republicans encouraged Aaron Burr to just please defer to Thomas Jefferson. You knew what the plan was all along. You were supposed to be vice president. He was supposed to be president. Just defer to him, be his vice president, and we will avoid this whole mess. But obviously, Jefferson, while he was supposed to be elected president, wasn't elected president. And although everyone knew this, including Aaron Burr, Burr refused to step down. He recognized this was his chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Enter Alexander Hamilton. Again, finding himself faced with an incredibly undesirable circumstance, Hamilton had to determine who he hated less, Thomas Jefferson or Aaron Burr. After some consideration, in a decision that may surprise some people, Hamilton chose Thomas Jefferson, writing that, quote, Mr. Jefferson, though he was too revolutionary in his notions, is yet a lover of liberty, and will be desirous of something like ordinary government. Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself, thinks of nothing but his own aggrandizement. In the choice of evils, let them, the Federalists in Congress, to take the least. Jefferson is, in my view, less dangerous than Burr. Unlike Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, likely still smarting from his friend's seeming public betrayal, refused to get involved. He could have likely had considerable influence to sway votes toward Jefferson, but he denied Jefferson that luxury. While some detractors think that Adams was trying to stick it to Jefferson with this decision, historians now widely accept that Adams was a man who believed strongly in the separation of powers, and genuinely thought that this situation was one for the legislature to figure out, not him. I mean, heck, the people had voted him out of office. On top of that, we now know privately John and Abigail both preferred Jefferson and expected him to win anyway. Like Hamilton, the Adams family didn't want either of them to be president, but if they had to choose, they clearly preferred Thomas Jefferson. And during this trying time, Adams and Jefferson kept in touch with each other and dealt with each other civilly, while the election in the House dragged on. Rumors of this election creating a clean break in the communication between Jefferson and Adams fit well into a very reductionist view of their relationship, but it just isn't the case. With about a month left in Adams' term, in late January 1801, Oliver Ellsworth, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, retired. Adams asked John Jay to take his place, but Jay politely declined. With that, Adams made a decision that has still had an incredible impact on American society today. He chose his friend, John Marshall, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. At only 45 years of age, this would be a decision that would impact the makeup of the court for the next generation, as Marshall ended up serving as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. As the calendar moved to February, and the House of Representatives prepared to vote for their preferred presidential candidate, there were some important decisions in Europe happening that would be impacting the future of the U.S. The Treaty of Montfortain, which officially declared peace between France and the U.S., was signed on February 3rd. This was just a rubber stamp process for a peace that everyone knew had already been agreed upon. But what the U.S. did not know was that Napoleon, while negotiating with the United States, was also negotiating with Spain in order to acquire the entire Louisiana territory. On February 11th, the members of the House of Representatives gathered to cast their votes for the next president of the United States. Crowds gathered, and there was an increasing tension in the air. A couple days into the process, Jefferson met with John Adams. Rumors were swirling that the Federalists were delaying some type of determined result, hoping that they'd be able to drag it out all the way into the next term and place the Federalist President pro tem of the Senate at the head of government. Desperately fearing a constitutional crisis, Thomas Jefferson once again entreated Adams to take action, please, and try to influence the Federalists. And once again, Adams refused. Adams explained to Jefferson that if he bent just a little bit on a few issues and assured the Federalists that he would negotiate or compromise with them, he would win instantly. It's not a big deal. Adams basically said, if you want it, you can go win it right now. But Jefferson responded and gave Adams, which I'm sure he appreciated, a very principled response by saying he could not do such a thing. If he were going to enter into the presidency, he was going to do it with the freedom to govern his way and not be beholden to anyone else. Once again, probably something John Adams could appreciate. But with that, Adams said, okay, well, if that's the case, then good luck. On Tuesday, February 17th, on the 36th ballot in the House, Thomas Jefferson was finally chosen as the third president of the United States. One Federalist representative in Delaware switched his vote, and it was finally all over. Jefferson was president. With Adams on his way out and the election providing America with its next president, it would make sense for Congress to punt major legislative issues to the new majority party, right? Well, not quite. There had been a bill that Adams had supported and was discussed a year prior that was passed into law during this, quote, lame duck period of American politics. The lame duck period, by the way, is the period in between and the election in November and the inauguration, which back then used to be in March, now it's in January. So it's like that period of a few months where all the people who are technically in the executive and in Congress are on their way out. They've been voted out, but they still technically have legislative and executive power until the clock strikes 12. So that's what this period is. And the fact that they passed this bill during this period was an enormous controversy. Because this bill doubled the number of circuit courts and added 23 judges to new positions. About a week prior to the inauguration, Adams had chosen all of these 23 men, and for the most part, he chose wisely. He appointed men who were competent and qualified. But here's the problem, especially from Thomas Jefferson's perspective. A Congress that had members that were voted out of office passed a bill that had an immediate and undeniable impact on the judicial branch. They added these positions to the judicial branch, a couple dozen of them, which meant that these positions needed to be filled immediately with a judge. And here's the thing. All 23 of these, were lifetime appointments. Who was in charge of filling them? None other than John Adams, the Federalist president, who had also just been voted out of office. To Jefferson, this was just he was incredulous. This was an incredible action taken by Adams and the Federalist. He was indignant at what the Democratic Republicans later dubbed the, quote, midnight appointments, as the legend was told that at midnight, the night before Jefferson's inauguration, Adams was still signing these commissions, although that's not really how it happened. It makes for a dramatic story, though. From Adams' perspective, this was something he had proposed a year earlier and was in favor of regardless of the election results. The timing of it, didn't look great, but if it weren't for the headache in France, this issue would have probably already been handled and would be a moot point. So Adams really didn't think he was doing anything wrong here. It's not like he lost the election, came up with the idea, and just packed the courts so he could have a longer-lasting Federalist impact, like out of, resentment or anger from losing. At least that's what he would argue. But from Jefferson's perspective, this was an action taken by a president who was resentful, jealous, and angry that he and his party was losing political power. In order for Adams and the Federalists to fight back against this, they packed the judicial branch with party loyalists, knowing that the impact of the decision would limit Jefferson and his party's ability to govern the way they wanted to for years into the future. Later in life, in letters to Abigail Adams, Thomas Jefferson would write that Adams' decision to follow through with these, quote, midnight appointments was the only thing Adams did professionally that Jefferson did not respect and would never forgive. On Wednesday, March 4th, Jefferson's inauguration day, Adams got into his carriage at 4 in the morning and left without anyone knowing any different. Months earlier, he had made the decision that he was not going to attend Jefferson's inauguration, and he was determined to be a man of his word. Adams' decision to depart in the dark of the night and in such an abrupt fashion was not accepted by men of either party. Both Federalists and Republicans alike thought this was a poor decision. His opponents viewed this as Adams being a petulant old man who refused to put aside his ego for what was best for the country. And whether his ego played a role in his decision or not, and it's difficult for me to imagine a world in which it played no role, objectively, it just wasn't good politics. If Adams had stayed around, shown grace and humility in defeat, and set the example in America that power transitions peacefully, then it would have been for the better. But alas, this is not how it went down. We don't know exactly why Adams wasn't there and never will because Adams was never asked. In his inaugural address, Jefferson played politics, addressing the Congress with the declaration that, quote, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He made sure to give homage to the late, great George Washington and promised to do his best to uphold the expectations of the office set forth by him. Jefferson didn't mention John Adams, though. And in the sharp contrast of the young, tall, slender, and soft-spoken Jefferson entering the White House, the old, short, plump, and toothless, bald John Adams made his way, the first leg of his trip, to Baltimore, never to see Thomas Jefferson ever again. Maybe Adams was bitter and resentful, but maybe not. He was done with all the headaches of the presidency, and likely very much looking forward to some aspects of retirement. With John Quincy on his way home, the Adams family would be whole once again, except, of course, for the presence of Charles. As you pack up your things, let's consider the state of the nation that Thomas Jefferson was inheriting. As Adams described it, the U.S. had, quote, "its coffers full and with fair prospects of peace, with all the world smiling in its face, its commerce flourishing, its navy glorious, its agriculture uncommonly productive and lucrative." In the end, John Adams had inherited a seemingly impossible task. He had entered office in the shadow of George Washington, with the nation politically divided. France was in the middle of a revolution, and Adams was tasked with ignoring the emotional desire to get involved and do what he thought would be best long-term for the nation. In the face of these circumstances, John Adams remained incredibly consistent and persistent, refusing to sacrifice his principles or risk the welfare of the American people. He had created a strong defense, with the Navy having over 50 ships and 5,000 members in 1801, while simultaneously working to keep peace. This buildup was, of course, a factor for Napoleon when negotiating with the U.S., and it seems, at least in hindsight, that Adams played his situation pretty perfectly. Oh, and did I mention that building up the Navy, not the Army, kept Alexander Hamilton's militarism from taking hold? John Adams created the precedent in American history that you can build up your defenses and seek peace at the same time. These two things were not, as it was believed, mutually exclusive. There were no scandals. There was no corruption. Adams always acted professional, except for small, few times here and there, he may have lost his temper privately. He refused to go to war in order to ensure Federalist power in re-election. He refused to be swayed by party politics that would have made him sacrifice his values and principles. Because of this, the American people were not forced into a war that would no doubt have been a huge mistake and potentially the end of America as we know it. This ability to keep us out of war and maintain peace with France was a life and career-defining mission, and Adams knew as much, once writing that, quote, "I desire no other inscription over my gravestone than, 'Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. When Adams first became president, he was praised for his character, consistency, and good intentions for this nation. While he surely made mistakes during his time in office, he did everything he could, even in the face of incredible personal attacks and pressure from his own party, to do what he thought was right for the American people, which, in the end, is all we can really ask for from a president, to put the people before himself. This selflessness is real leadership. David McCulloch, in his biography of Adams, wraps up this period far better than I ever could when he says that, quote, subjected to some of the most malicious attacks ever endured by a president, beset by personal disloyalty and political betrayal, suffering the loss of his mother, the near death of his wife, the death of a son, tormented by physical ailments, he had more than weathered the storm. His bedrock integrity, his spirit of independence, his devotion to his country, his marriage, his humor, and the great underlying love of life were all still very much intact. Next week, we'll turn our attention to the first Democratic-Republican president in American history, Thomas Jefferson. And we will usher in a new chapter and a wildly different approach to governing this young nation. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.